Welcome back to the Dirty Secrets channel. Are you ready for this incredible story? Enjoy the video.
Have you ever worked yourself to exhaustion trying to earn love from someone who is never going to give it? You stay late at the office on their projects. You cancel your own plans to help with theirs. You swallow your pride every single time they criticize you in front of others because maybe, just maybe, if you're good enough, patient enough, perfect enough, they'll finally see you. They'll finally acknowledge that you matter. But that day never comes, does it? You tell yourself it's because they're busy. You tell yourself they show love differently. You tell yourself that the ache in your chest every time they praise someone else is just you being oversensitive. But deep down, in that quiet place you don't like to visit, you know the truth. You know you've been chasing approval from someone who enjoys watching you chase it. You know that no amount of success, sacrifice, or loyalty will ever be enough because the problem was never you. It was always them. You're not imagining it. You're not being dramatic. That exhaustion you feel isn't from working hard. It's from carrying the weight of someone else's cruelty while pretending it's normal. The person in this story spent 32 years doing exactly that. 32 years trying to be worthy of a father who saw him as nothing more than free labor. And the day he finally discovered what his father had been hiding, it didn't just change his life. It destroyed every lie he'd been telling himself about family, loyalty, and love. This is Daniel's story, and it started in a parking garage on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was sitting in my Honda Civic with the engine off, watching my father walk toward his Mercedes, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not from cold, not from fear, from rage so pure it felt like my blood had turned to gasoline and someone had just struck a match. In my lap was a manila folder I'd found 20 minutes earlier in a filing cabinet I wasn't supposed to open, and inside that folder was evidence of something so calculated, so deliberate, so breathtakingly cruel that I couldn't process it. My brain kept trying to find an explanation that didn't end with my father being a monster, but the numbers didn't lie. The signatures didn't lie. The dates didn't lie. And the name at the bottom of every single document was mine. My name. My social security number. My entire financial future, signed away before I was old enough to understand what a signature meant. I watched him unlock his car, check his phone, and drive away without a single glance in my direction, which was ironic because that's basically how he'd treated me my entire life. Invisible until he needed something, worthless unless I was useful, and apparently even more valuable when I didn't know I was being used. My name is Daniel Chen. I'm 32 years old, and until that Tuesday in March, I genuinely believed I was the problem. I believed that if I just worked harder, achieved more, proved myself more completely, my father would finally look at me the way he looked at my older brother Kevin, with pride, with respect, with anything other than cold assessment, like I was a quarterly earnings report that consistently underperformed. I'm a certified public accountant, which is funny in the most terrible way possible because the skills that let me discover what he did are the exact same skills he spent my entire childhood telling me were wasted on someone like me. Too detail-oriented, he'd say. Too cautious. Too afraid to take risks. Meanwhile, Kevin, the golden child, the visionary, the one who could do no wrong, he got to be creative. He got to be bold. He got to make mistakes and have them called learning experiences while mine were called failures. I grew up in Pasadena in a house that looked perfect from the outside, which I guess is fitting. My father, Richard Chen, owned a commercial real estate development company that he built from nothing, a fact he reminded us of approximately 4,000 times a year. My mother died when I was 7, breast cancer, and after that it was just the three of us. Dad, Kevin, and me. Except it wasn't really the three of us. It was Dad and Kevin. And then there was me, the spare parts kid, the one who existed to make their lives easier. Kevin was 5 years older, charismatic, confident, everything I wasn't. And from the time I was old enough to understand family dynamics, I understood that I was the placeholder child, the backup plan, the one who didn't quite measure up but was kept around anyway because family is family, right? The house itself was a 4-bedroom craftsman on a tree-lined street where every lawn was perfect and every mailbox matched. My father loved that house because it looked successful. It looked like the kind of place a self-made man would live after conquering the American dream. Inside, it was different. Inside, it was museum quiet and carefully controlled, a place where emotions were inconvenient and expectations were absolute. My mother had made it warm once, or so I've been told. I barely remember that version. What I remember is the version after she died, where my father turned grief into productivity, and Kevin turned it into charm, and I turned it into silence because silence was safe. I have this memory from when I was 8, about a year after my mother passed. I'd gotten an A on a math test, the first A I'd gotten since she died because grief makes it hard to focus when you're a kid and nobody's helping you process it. I showed it to my father at dinner, so proud, thinking maybe this would make him smile. He looked at it for maybe 3 seconds, then handed it back and said, "Kevin got straight A's when he was your age." Then he went back to his pot roast like I hadn't said anything at all. Kevin, sitting across from me, didn't defend me, didn't tell Dad I was doing my best. Just gave me this sympathetic look that somehow made it worse, like he felt sorry for me, but also agreed that I wasn't quite good enough. That was the last time I showed my father a grade. That was the last time I expected praise for anything academic. I learned right then that achievement didn't matter unless it was exceptional, and exceptional was a moving target that stayed just out of my reach. Kevin wasn't cruel, not in an obvious way. He was just the favorite, and he knew it, and he enjoyed it the way anyone would enjoy being loved more. He'd ruffle my hair and call me buddy, and give me advice I never asked for about how to impress Dad, completely oblivious to the fact that nothing I did would ever impress Dad because I wasn't him. When Kevin played basketball in high school, my father went to every game, drove hours to away games, rearranged business meetings to make sure he was there. When I joined the academic decathlon team, my father asked why I was wasting time on activities that wouldn't help me get into college. When I pointed out that academic achievements literally did help with college admissions, he said real achievements happen in the real world, not in a classroom competing for trophies nobody cares about. I won state championships in 2 categories my junior year. He didn't come to a single competition. He was busy, he said. The business needed him. Kevin had a basketball game. There was always a reason that sounded legitimate until you realized the reason was just that I didn't matter enough. My mother's mother, the grandmother I mentioned, she tried to fill some of that gap. Her name was Helen, and she was small and fierce and completely unimpressed by my father's success. She'd been a school teacher for 40 years before retiring, and she had that teacher energy where she could see through bullshit from across a room. She lived in Alhambra in a house my father bought her after my mother died, which sounds generous until you realize he only did it so he could hold it over her head for the rest of her life. Every time she criticized him, every time she questioned his parenting, he'd remind her that she was living in his house, on his dime, and maybe she should be grateful instead of judgmental. She'd remind him that her daughter had a life insurance policy, and he'd use that money for the down payment, so actually it was her daughter's house, not his. They hated each other with the kind of polite venom that only family can sustain for decades. Grandma Helen saw everything. She saw how my father treated me differently than Kevin. She saw how I shrank myself to avoid criticism. She saw how I worked twice as hard for half the recognition and convinced myself that was normal. And she tried to tell me, over and over, that it wasn't normal, that fathers were supposed to love their children equally, that my worth wasn't determined by my usefulness, that I deserved better. But when you're a kid, and your only parent is telling you one thing and your grandmother is telling you another, you believe the parent. You have to. Because if you believe your grandmother, you have to accept that your father doesn't love you, and that's too big and too terrible for a child's brain to hold. I started working for my father's company when I was 16, not because I wanted to, because he told me I was going to, and in our house, what Richard Chen said was law. I filed paperwork after school, I organized receipts on weekends, I learned QuickBooks while my friends were learning to drive, and every single time I did something right, every single time I caught an error or streamlined a process or saved him money, you know what I got? Nothing. Not a thank you. Not a good job. Nothing. But when I made a mistake, when I transposed 2 numbers or misfiled something, that's when I got his attention. That's when I got the lecture about how success requires precision and maybe I should spend less time on my hobbies and more time developing a work ethic. I stopped having hobbies when I was 17. After high school, I went to UCLA for accounting. Not because I loved it, because my father told me the company needed a good accountant, and Kevin wasn't interested in that kind of detail work. Kevin was getting his MBA, learning the big picture stuff, preparing to take over the company someday. I was learning to count beans, as my father so affectionately put it, but I was good at it, really good. I graduated top of my class, passed my CPA exam on the first try, and went to work for a mid-sized firm in downtown LA, where I learned that not every boss treats their employees like disappointments with pulses. I learned what it felt like to have my work acknowledged, to be valued, to be seen as competent instead of constantly inadequate. I should have stayed there. I should have built my own career, my own life, far away from my father and his company, and the constant feeling that I was auditing for a role I'd never get. But when I was 26, my father called me into his office and told me he needed me. Not wanted, needed. The company was expanding, he said. Kevin was handling acquisitions and development. They needed someone trustworthy to manage the financial side, someone who understood the business, someone family. And like an idiot, like a kid who never stopped hoping that maybe this time would be different, I said yes. I left my job, took a pay cut, and went back to working for a man who'd spent my entire life making me feel like I wasn't enough. Because he said he needed me. Because somewhere in my stupid, hopeful brain, I thought that meant he finally saw my value. I worked for Chen Development for 6 years. 6 years of 12-hour days and weekend emergencies and vacation days I never took because there was always something that needed handling. 6 years of watching Kevin get credit for projects I managed, deals I structured, problems I solved. 6 years of my father introducing Kevin as his successor and me as our accountant, like I was hired help instead of his son. And I took it. All of it. Because that's what I did. That's what I'd always done. I swallowed the disrespect, I buried the resentment, and I told myself that this was just how he was, that he showed love through providing opportunities, not words, that I should be grateful he trusted me with the finances. There were specific moments that should have been wake-up calls, moments where I should have realized what I was doing to myself by staying, like the time I caught $1 million error in a property appraisal 2 days before closing. The appraisal had the square footage wrong, which inflated the value, which would have meant we'd massively overpaid for a commercial property in Glendale. I spent 18 hours going through county records, surveyor reports, building permits, everything I could find, and I proved the error. I saved the company from a deal that would have lost us money for years. My father's response? He told Kevin good job on catching that right in front of me, and Kevin just smiled and said thanks, Dad, even though he'd had nothing to do with it. When I tried to correct him, when I said actually I was the one who found the error, my father waved his hand like I was being petty and said, "It's a team effort, Daniel. We all contribute." Then he took Kevin out to lunch to celebrate, and I went back to my office and wondered what the hell I was doing with my life. Or the time Kevin made a handshake deal on a property acquisition without consulting anyone, without reviewing the financials, without doing any due diligence, and it turned out the property had environmental contamination that would cost $300,000 to remediate. I spent 6 months negotiating with the EPA, finding contractors, restructuring the deal so we could still make it profitable. 6 months of my life fixing Kevin's impulsive mistake. And when it was done, my father told Kevin he admired his vision, his willingness to take risks, his entrepreneurial spirit. He told me I'd done adequate work handling the cleanup. Adequate. Like I'd turned in a mediocre book report instead of saving us from a financial catastrophe. The office itself was in Pasadena, a renovated historic building that my father loved because it had character, which was his word for expensive and impractical. My office was on the 2nd floor, a windowless room that had been a storage closet before they needed a place to put me. Kevin's office was on the same floor as my father's, corner office, windows overlooking Colorado Boulevard, furniture he'd picked out himself. My desk was a standard office supply special, with a chair that squeaked and a computer that crashed twice a week because nobody wanted to budget for IT upgrades for the accounting department. I'd asked for new equipment once, explained that I needed reliable technology to do my job properly, and my father had said, "We're not made of money, Daniel. Make it work." This was 6 months after he'd approved a $50,000 renovation of the executive bathroom. I ate lunch at my desk every day. Not because I was too busy. Because eating in the break room meant running into Kevin and my father and whatever client they were schmoozing that day, and I couldn't take the performance. Couldn't take watching Kevin tell stories about deals and projects and acting like he'd done everything himself while my father beamed with pride. Couldn't take being invisible in a room full of people I worked with every day. So I ate sad sandwiches at my desk and told myself I was being productive, using the time to catch up on work, when really I was just hiding. The worst part was watching my father with clients. He was a completely different person. Charming, attentive, interested in their lives, their families, their hobbies. He'd ask about their kids' soccer games. He'd remember birthdays. He'd send gift baskets and handwritten notes and make people feel valued and seen. And I'd watch him do it and think, this is what it looks like when my father cares about someone. This is the version of him other people get. And then he'd turn to me and ask for a file or tell me to reschedule something, and his voice would be flat and businesslike, and I'd remember that I was staff, not son. A resource to be managed, not a person to be loved. My grandmother, my mother's mother, tried to warn me. She lived in a small house in Alhambra that my father paid for, which he reminded her of frequently, and whenever I visited, she'd look at me with these sad, knowing eyes and ask me why I was still there. Why I was still trying to earn something from a man who didn't know how to give it. I'd tell her she didn't understand, that Dad was just focused on the business, that he did care, he just didn't show it the way other people did. And she'd shake her head and say, Daniel, sweetheart, there's a difference between a man who doesn't show love and a man who doesn't feel it. Your father knows exactly what he's doing to you. The question is, when are you going to know it too? I didn't understand what she meant. Not until that Tuesday in March, sitting in my car with a folder full of documents that proved she'd been right all along. It started because of a leaking pipe, which is such a stupid, mundane reason for your entire world to implode that I almost can't believe it. We have a storage unit where we keep old financial records, stuff that's too old to need regular access but too important to destroy. Tax returns from 20 years ago, incorporation documents, that kind of thing. The unit is in a facility in El Monte, and I'm the only one who ever goes there because of course I am. I'm the one who handles the administrative details nobody else wants to deal with. The facility manager called me on a Tuesday morning to tell me there'd been a pipe leak in the unit above ours, and I should probably come check if any damage had occurred. I drove out there during lunch, expecting to spend 20 minutes confirming everything was fine, and instead I spent 2 hours discovering that everything was not fine. Everything was the opposite of fine. The leak had damaged a box on the top shelf, and when I pulled it down, the bottom gave out. Papers went everywhere. I was on my hands and knees gathering them up when I found a file labeled Daniel Chen Trust Account, which made me freeze because I didn't have a trust account. I'd never had a trust account. Trust accounts are for people with family money, with inheritances, with generational wealth to protect. We weren't that kind of family. My father built his company from nothing, remember? We were self-made, bootstrapped. No silver spoons here. But apparently that wasn't true. I sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit and read through every page in that file, and with each page, my understanding of my entire life shifted. The trust had been established by my maternal grandfather when I was born, funded with $200,000, and structured to pay out when I turned 25. Except I never received it. I never even knew it existed. And the reason I never knew was because when I was 17 years old, my father had filed paperwork to redirect the trust payments to a different account. An account I didn't control. An account I didn't know about. An account that, according to the statements in that file, had been systematically drained for the past 15 years to cover expenses related to Chen development. My inheritance, the money my grandfather left specifically for me, had been used as a slush fund for my father's business. And that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the signatures. Every single document required my signature, and every single signature was there, neat and perfect, dated from when I was 17 to when I was 25. 8 years of authorizations I never made. 8 years of permissions I never gave. 8 years of my name in my handwriting, signing away money I didn't know I had. Before we continue, I want to take a moment to say something. If this story is resonating with you, if you're seeing pieces of your own life in what I'm sharing, you're not alone. This channel exists because too many people suffer in silence, thinking their pain doesn't matter or that no one would understand. But I understand, and thousands of people in this community understand. If you want to be part of a space where these stories are told, where the truth comes out, and where people like us finally get to see justice served, even if it's just in a story, then please subscribe. I share these stories every week, and I read every single comment. You matter here. Your story matters here. Now let's get back to what happened next. I took the entire file. I didn't ask permission. I didn't tell anyone I was taking it. I just walked out of that storage unit with a manila folder under my arm and a sick, hollow feeling in my stomach that I couldn't name yet. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was more like vertigo, like the ground had disappeared and I was falling but hadn't hit bottom yet. I drove back to the office, went straight to my desk, and did what I do best. I started looking at numbers. If my father had forged my signature once, what else had he forged? If he'd stolen from one account, were there others? I had access to everything. Every bank account, every transaction record, every contract and agreement and piece of paperwork that flowed through Chen Development. And for the first time in 6 years, I wasn't looking at those records to make sure they were accurate. I was looking for patterns, inconsistencies, evidence. It took me 3 weeks to find it all, working late every night after everyone else went home, copying files to a personal hard drive I kept locked in my car. And what I found made the trust fund theft look almost quaint by comparison. My father hadn't just stolen my inheritance, he'd been systematically defrauding the company for years. Phantom expenses that went to shell companies he controlled, invoices from contractors who didn't exist, property purchases made with company money that somehow ended up titled in his personal name. And the beautiful, terrible irony? He'd used me to do it. My access, my credentials, my digital signature on documents I'd never seen. I was the company CPA, the one who supposedly reviewed and approved every major financial transaction, which meant every piece of fraud had my name attached to it. If anyone ever investigated, if the IRS ever came knocking, I wouldn't just be the victim. I'd be the prime suspect. The scope of it was staggering. Over 8 years, my father had siphoned off nearly $4 million from Chen Development. Not all at once. Not in obvious chunks that would trigger audits. Small amounts spread across dozens of transactions, each one unremarkable on its own, but together forming a pattern so clear I couldn't believe I'd never seen it before. Except I had seen it. I'd reviewed these transactions. I'd entered them into our accounting system. I'd filed the tax returns that claimed them as legitimate business expenses. I just hadn't been looking for fraud because it never occurred to me that my own father would set me up like this. There was a shell company called Pacific Consulting Services that billed us for advisory services. 20,000 here, 30,000 there, always just under the threshold that would require board approval. I found the incorporation documents, filed in Delaware, which should have been a red flag. Sole proprietor listed as Richard Chen. No employees, no office, no actual services performed. Just a bank account that received our money and then immediately transferred it to another account in the Cayman Islands. I traced every payment we'd made to Pacific Consulting over 6 years. $340,000 for consulting that never happened. There was a property in Riverside that we'd purchased for $800,000 using company funds for a development project that never materialized. The purchase was in our books, properly documented, properly depreciated. Except when I pulled the actual title, the property wasn't owned by Chen Development. It was owned by Richard Chen personally. He'd bought it with company money and put it in his name. When the company decided not to develop it, he'd sold it privately for $1.2 million and pocketed the profit. And my digital signature was on every document authorizing the purchase. There were contractor invoices from companies that didn't exist. JSR Construction billed us for $200,000 in renovations on a property in Anaheim. I called the number on the invoice, disconnected. I looked up the business license. Never existed. I found the incorporation papers. Filed 3 months before the first invoice, dissolved 3 months after the last one. And the registered agent? A mail forwarding service in Nevada that my father had used before for other shell companies. The money had gone to a business account, then immediately to another account I couldn't trace, but I didn't need to trace it. I knew where it went. Every night I spent digging through these files, I'd find something new, some fresh betrayal, some new way my father had used my trust, my access, my name to steal. And every night I'd drive home and sit in my apartment and feel this cold, crystallizing rage that was nothing like anger. Anger is hot. Anger makes you want to scream and throw things and confront people. This was different. This was clarity. This was understanding, finally, exactly who my father was and what I needed to do about it. I started keeping detailed notes, not just copying files, but documenting everything in a narrative format that would make sense to someone who didn't live in my head. Date, transaction, amount, evidence of fraud, connection to my father. I created spreadsheets. I made timelines. I found emails where my father had instructed our bookkeeper to code certain expenses in ways that didn't match what they actually were. I found text messages where he'd told Kevin to approve invoices without my review because Daniel overthinks everything. I built a case against my own father the same way I'd build a case against any criminal, methodically and thoroughly and without emotion. My hands shook sometimes when I was doing this, not from fear, from adrenaline, from the feeling of finally having power in a relationship where I'd never had any before. He'd made me small my entire life. He'd made me doubt myself, second-guess myself, feel grateful for scraps of attention. And now I had proof. Documented, irrefutable, legally actionable proof that he was a fraud and a thief and a man who'd sacrificed his own son's future for money he didn't even need. I started having nightmares. Not the normal kind where you're falling or being chased. Specific, vivid nightmares about federal prison, about fraud charges, about sitting in a courtroom while a prosecutor showed a jury document after document with my signature on them and asking how I could claim I didn't know. I'd wake up at 3 a.m, drenched in sweat, and instead of trying to go back to sleep, I'd go to my computer and keep looking, keep documenting, keep building the case I didn't know yet if I'd ever use. My father noticed something was off. I'd always been quiet, always been compliant, but now I was different in a way he couldn't quite name. Distant, distracted. He asked me if everything was all right, and I looked him right in the eye and said everything was fine, and I felt nothing. No guilt for lying, no fear of being caught, just cold clinical detachment, like I was studying a specimen instead of talking to my father. He didn't push it. He never did care enough to push. Kevin noticed too, but for different reasons. He cornered me in the break room one afternoon and asked if I was job hunting, because I'd been acting weird and he wanted to make sure I wasn't planning to leave them in the lurch. The arrogance of it, the assumption that my entire existence should revolve around making his life easier, it would have been funny if it wasn't so perfectly on brand. I told him I wasn't going anywhere, which was true. I wasn't leaving. Not until I was ready. Not until I had everything I needed. I found a lawyer. Not someone local, not someone who might have connections to my father or his business. I found a white-collar criminal defense attorney in San Diego named Patricia Vega, who specialized in financial fraud cases, and I drove down to meet with her on a Saturday morning in May. I brought my hard drive. I brought the trust fund file. I brought 15 years of pain wrapped up in a professional demeanor and a very simple question. If I report this, do I go to prison too? She spent 4 hours reviewing my evidence. 4 hours of silence except for the sound of her typing and occasionally asking me to clarify a date or explain a transaction. And when she finally looked up, she said, "Daniel, you're not going to prison, but your father is." And then she smiled. Not a happy smile, a grim smile. A smile that said she'd seen this before and she knew exactly how it would end. And she asked me if I was ready for what came next. I told her I'd been ready my entire life. I just hadn't known it until now. Patricia was in her 50s, sharp and precise in a way that reminded me of my grandmother. She'd built her career defending people accused of white-collar crimes, and somewhere along the way, she'd realized that half her clients were actually guilty, and the other half were scapegoats for people in power. She hated the second category, hated watching powerful men throw underlings under the bus to save themselves. When I told her my story, when I explained how my father had used my credentials and my signatures and my position to cover his own fraud, something shifted in her expression. She'd heard this before. She'd seen this before, and she was going to make sure it ended differently this time. She explained that we had options. We could go to the state attorney general. We could go to the IRS. We could go to the SEC if we wanted to argue securities fraud. But the best option, the one most likely to result in serious consequences for my father and full protection for me, was the FBI. Federal charges, federal prosecution, federal prison if convicted. The FBI had a financial crimes unit that specialized in exactly this kind of fraud, and they loved cases with cooperative witnesses who had documentation. Cases they could actually win. But going to the FBI meant I needed immunity, not just a handshake agreement. An actual legally binding document that said I was a witness and victim, not a co-conspirator. That meant Patricia had to contact the FBI before I did, present my case, negotiate terms. It meant weeks of back and forth while I continued to go to work and pretend everything was normal. It meant risk. If my father found out what I was doing before the immunity agreement was signed, he could destroy evidence. He could claim I was the one committing fraud. He could use his money and his connections and his reputation to bury me. So we had to be careful. We had to be patient. We had to wait for the right moment. Patricia had a contact in the FBI's Los Angeles field office, an agent named Marcus Webb who specialized in corporate fraud. She reached out to him in June, gave him a broad overview of the case without naming names, asked if it was something his unit would be interested in pursuing. He said yes. He said if the evidence was as strong as she claimed, if the witness was credible and cooperative, they'd absolutely be interested. So she sent him a summary, a 30-page document outlining every fraudulent transaction, every shell company, every forged signature. She included copies of key documents, enough to prove the case had merit but not so much that the FBI could prosecute without me. She made it clear that I was the victim here, that my cooperation was contingent on immunity, and that without me they'd have a much harder time proving intent. Agent Webb called her 2 days later. He wanted to meet with me. He wanted to see the full evidence. He wanted to hear my story in person, not filtered through my attorney. So in late June, on a Thursday afternoon, I told my father I was visiting a potential client in San Diego. I sat in a conference room at the FBI field office and told a federal agent every detail of how my own father had destroyed my life. Marcus Webb was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with the kind of calm, patient demeanor that probably made suspects think they could trust him. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush me. Just let me talk for 2 hours straight, occasionally asking clarifying questions, taking notes in a small notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. When I was done, when I'd told him everything from the trust fund to the shell companies to the forged signatures, he sat back and said, "Your father's going to prison, and you're going to help us put him there." He explained the process. First, they'd verify my evidence, cross-reference my documents with their own databases, confirm that the shell companies existed and the transactions happened the way I said they did. Then they'd start building the broader case, interviewing witnesses, subpoenaing records, following the money trails I'd identified. It would take months, maybe longer. And during all of that, I'd need to act normal, keep working, keep attending family dinners, keep being the dutiful son while they built a case that would destroy my father's life. Could I do that? Could I sit across from him at dinner knowing that federal agents were investigating him? Could I smile and nod and play my role? I said yes, because what was the alternative? Let him get away with it? Let him keep stealing and lying and using people? Let him win? No. I'd spent 32 years letting him win. I was done. The immunity agreement took 6 weeks to finalize. 6 weeks of my lawyer and the federal prosecutor going back and forth on language, on scope, on exactly what I'd be required to do in exchange for complete protection. I had to provide all evidence in my possession. I had to testify at grand jury proceedings if required. I had to testify at trial if it went that far. I had to be available for interviews and depositions and any other requests the prosecution made. In exchange, I received complete immunity from any criminal charges related to the fraudulent transactions, a written agreement that I was classified as a victim and witness, and protection from civil liability related to my role in the company. Patricia made them put it all in writing, made them sign it before I handed over a single additional document. And when it was done, When I had a signed immunity agreement from the United States Attorney's Office, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Safe. Protected. Like I wasn't alone anymore. Patricia explained the process. We couldn't just go to the police with this. Financial fraud cases are complicated, especially when they involve forged signatures and shell companies and years of transactions. We needed the right agency, the right jurisdiction, the right timing, and most importantly, we needed to make sure I was protected. She drafted an immunity agreement. She contacted the FBI. She structured everything so that I would be treated as a witness and victim, not a co-conspirator. And while she did all that, she told me to do nothing. Change nothing. Act normal. Go to work. Smile at your father. Wait. So that's what I did. I waited. I went to work every day and reviewed spreadsheets and attended meetings and played the role of dutiful son and reliable employee. I had dinner with my father and Kevin once a week, a tradition my father insisted on because family is important, and I sat across from them and made small talk and pretended I didn't know that in 6 months, 8 months, a year, everything was going to come crashing down. Kevin talked about expansion plans. My father talked about legacy, about building something that would last beyond him, about how proud he was of what we'd built together. And I nodded. I agreed. I said all the right things. And inside, I felt nothing but cold, patient rage. My grandmother's health started declining that summer. She'd been fighting emphysema for years, a consequence of smoking in her youth that she deeply regretted, and by July she was on oxygen full-time. I visited her every Sunday, and one afternoon while I was helping her organize her medications, she asked me if I'd figured it out yet. Figured what out, I asked, even though I knew. Figured out who your father really is, she said. Figured out that you don't owe him anything, that you never did. I told her I was working on it, and she took my hand with her thin, fragile fingers and said, "Your mother would be so angry if she knew what he'd done to you. She'd want you to fight back. She'd want you to win." She died in August, quietly, in her sleep, the way she'd wanted to. My father paid for the funeral, another fact he made sure everyone knew, and gave a eulogy about what a strong woman she'd been, how she'd overcome such hardship, how she'd been the backbone of our family. And I sat in the front row next to Kevin and listened to him lie and thought about how my grandmother had seen through him from the beginning, how she'd tried to warn me, how she'd died hoping I'd finally understand. I understood. The FBI started their investigation in September. They were quiet about it, discreet, the way federal agents are when they're building a case they want to be airtight. They interviewed contractors. They subpoenaed bank records. They traced shell companies and phantom expenses and every single fraudulent transaction my father had made over the past decade. And through it all, my father suspected nothing. He was too confident. Too sure of his own cleverness, too certain that he'd covered his tracks. In November, Kevin started talking about promoting me, not out of respect, out of practicality. They were expanding into Arizona, opening a new office in Phoenix, and they needed someone to run the financial operations, someone trustworthy, someone who knew the business inside and out, someone they didn't have to train. I said I'd think about it, which made my father happy because in his mind, my thinking about it meant I'd say yes. I always said yes. That's what I did. That's who I was to him. Except I wasn't that person anymore. The FBI told Patricia they had enough in December. Enough evidence. Enough testimony. Enough documentation to prove not just fraud, but a pattern of fraud, systematic and deliberate and impossible to explain away. They scheduled the arrest for January 15th. They wanted to do it at the office during business hours, where there would be witnesses and no chance for my father to destroy evidence. Patricia asked me if I wanted to be there, if I wanted to watch. I said yes. I wanted to see his face when he realized I knew, when he realized I'd known for almost a year, when he realized that the son he'd underestimated his entire life had just destroyed him. But I didn't just want to watch him get arrested. I wanted him to know why. I scheduled a meeting for January 14th, the day before the arrest. Just me and my father in his office, ostensibly to go over the Phoenix expansion budget. He was in a good mood, which was rare. Kevin had just closed a major deal, and my father loved nothing more than success he could take credit for. I sat down across from his desk with my laptop and a folder, and I said, "Before we talk about Phoenix, there's something I need to show you." I opened the folder. I took out the trust fund documents. I placed them on his desk one by one, watching his expression shift from confusion to recognition to something that might have been fear if my father was capable of fear. The first document was the original trust agreement, the one my grandfather had established when I was born. The second was the amended agreement my father had filed when I was 17, redirecting the payments to an account I didn't control. The third was a bank statement showing every disbursement from that account over 15 years, all of them going to Chen development expenses. And the fourth was a handwriting analysis I'd paid for out of my own pocket, comparing my signatures on those documents to my actual signature, proving they were forgeries. He stared at the documents for a long time, long enough that I could hear the clock on his wall ticking, long enough that I started to wonder if he was going to say anything at all. Then he looked up at me with this expression, this carefully neutral expression that he used in negotiations, and he said, "Where did you find these?" And I said, "The storage unit in El Monte." There was a leak. Box got damaged. Papers fell out. I picked them up. I read them. And then I spent the last 9 months figuring out exactly what you've been doing to me since I was 17 years old. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of his face, still playing calm. Still thinking he could negotiate his way out of this the way he'd negotiated his way through every other problem in his life. He said, "Daniel, this is more complicated than you understand. That money, I used it to grow the business, to create opportunities for you and Kevin, to build something real." I laughed. Actually laughed. A short, bitter sound that surprised both of us. I said, "You used it to buy a vacation house in Lake Tahoe. You used it to buy your Mercedes. You used it to fund shell companies so you could steal from your own business. Don't insult me by pretending this was about creating opportunities." His jaw tightened. A crack in the mask. He said, "You have no idea what it takes to run a business, what it takes to keep things going during downturns. That money kept this company afloat when we would have gone under. It kept Kevin employed. It kept you employed." I said, "It wasn't your money. It was mine. My grandfather left it to me. Not to you. Not to the business. To me. And you stole it. You forged my signature. You set up accounts in my name without my knowledge. You used me as a shield for your own fraud. And you did it all while making me feel like I was worthless. While making me think I should be grateful you let me work here." He stood up then, and for a second I thought he might actually try to intimidate me physically. He was taller than me, broader, and he'd spent my whole life using his physical presence to make me feel small. But I didn't feel small anymore. I felt cold and clear and powerful in a way I'd never felt before. I had evidence. I had the FBI. I had an immunity agreement signed by a federal prosecutor. He had nothing but anger and fear and the dawning realization that he'd miscalculated badly. He said, his voice low and dangerous, "If you do this, if you go to the authorities with this, you'll destroy this company. You'll destroy Kevin's future. You'll destroy everything I've built." And I said, "No. You already destroyed it. I'm just making sure everyone knows who did it." He slammed his hand on the desk. Papers jumped. A pen rolled onto the floor. He said, "I'm your father. You owe me loyalty. You owe me respect. Everything you have, everything you are, you owe to me." And that's when I stood up. That's when I looked him directly in the eye and said the thing I'd been wanting to say for 32 years. I said, "I don't owe you anything. I never did. You were supposed to love me. You were supposed to protect me. You were supposed to be proud of me just for existing, not because I was useful to you. That's what fathers do. But you're not a father. You're a man who had children because it benefited you. Because Kevin could be your heir, and I could be your shield. You never loved me. You just used me. And now everyone's going to know it." He looked at me like I'd slapped him. And then, and this is the part I'll never forget, he said, "You were always weak. Your mother would be ashamed of what you've become." And I smiled. Actually smiled. Because that's when I knew I'd already won. When someone has nothing left but attacking your dead mother, they've lost. I said, My mother would be ashamed of you. She'd be ashamed that you took her son and spent 32 years breaking him down, that you stole from him, that you used him, that you made him feel worthless so he'd be easier to control. Grandma Helen knew exactly who you were. She tried to warn me for years. I just didn't want to see it. But I see it now. And tomorrow morning, so will everyone else. I told him about the FBI then. Told him about the investigation that had been going on for months. Told him about the shell companies they'd traced, the witnesses they'd interviewed, the evidence they'd collected. Told him that tomorrow, agents would walk into this office with a warrant for his arrest on federal fraud charges, that they'd seize the company's records, that they'd freeze his assets, that Kevin would probably be charged as an accessory because his signature was on half the fraudulent documents, that everything he'd spent 40 years building would collapse in a single day. And told him that I'd be fine, that I had immunity, that I was classified as a victim and witness, that when this was over, I'd walk away clean while he spent the next decade in federal prison. His face went pale. Actually pale. I'd never seen color drain from someone's face like that outside of movies. He sat back down slowly, like his legs couldn't hold him anymore, and he said, "You do this to your own family? You destroy us?" And I said, "You did this, not me. You made the choices. You committed the fraud. You forged the signatures. You used your own son as cover for crimes. All I did was tell the truth. That's the difference between us, Dad. I spent my whole life trying to be good enough for you, trying to earn your respect, your love, and you spent that whole time stealing from me, using me, setting me up to take the fall if you ever got caught. So yeah, I'm doing this, because it's not about destroying you. It's about making sure you can't destroy anyone else." I walked toward the door. He said my name, just my name, Daniel, quiet, almost pleading. I stopped but didn't turn around. He said, "Please, we can work this out, we can fix this, just give me time." And I said, "I gave you 32 years. You used every single one of them to hurt me. We're done." That was the last time I spoke to my father as a free man. I walked out of his office. I went home. I blocked his number and Kevin's number. And the next morning, I sat in Patricia's office in San Diego and watched the news coverage of FBI agents escorting my father out of Chen Development in handcuffs. They arrested Kevin an hour later. Not for fraud, but for conspiracy and falsifying records, charges that Patricia said probably wouldn't stick, but would definitely cost him years of legal fees and destroy his reputation. The company collapsed within 6 months. Clients pulled contracts, partners severed ties. The Phoenix expansion never happened. Everything my father had built fell apart the same way he'd built it, quickly and ruthlessly, and without mercy. His trial lasted 3 weeks. I didn't attend most of it. I didn't need to. I'd already given my testimony, 9 hours of detailed explanation about how he'd forged my signature, stolen my inheritance, and used me as cover for 15 years of financial fraud. The prosecution used my evidence as the backbone of their case. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They found him guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay full restitution, which he couldn't because his assets had been seized. He filed for bankruptcy from his cell. Kevin never went to prison, but the charges ruined him. No legitimate business would touch him after that. Last I heard, he was working sales at a car dealership in Riverside, which isn't criminal but has to sting for someone who thought he was destined to run an empire. I got my money back. All of it. The trust fund plus interest plus a settlement for my father's seized assets. It wasn't the empire he'd promised Kevin. It wasn't generational wealth. But it was enough to start over. Enough to build something clean. I moved to Portland. I started my own accounting firm, small and specialized, working with nonprofits and small businesses that need someone who actually cares about accuracy instead of profit margins. I'm good at it. Really good. And for the first time in my life, I'm doing work that feels like mine instead of something I'm doing to prove myself to someone who was never going to be impressed. I think about my grandmother sometimes, about how she told me my mother would want me to fight back, would want me to win. I think I did. Not because I destroyed my father, although I did that too, but because I stopped letting him define my worth. I stopped waiting for approval that was never coming. I stopped playing a rigged game and built a new one with different rules. My father writes me letters from prison sometimes. They're forwarded through Patricia because I never gave him my new address. I don't read them. I don't need to know if he's sorry or angry or still convinced he did nothing wrong. It doesn't matter anymore. He doesn't matter anymore. He's just a cautionary tale now, a reminder that people will take from you exactly as much as you let them, and the only way to win is to stop playing their game entirely. I'm 34 now. I have a life that's mine. A business I built. Friends who actually like me instead of just tolerating me. And every morning when I wake up, I don't feel that sick, hollow ache anymore. I don't feel like I'm auditioning for a role I'll never get. I just feel free. Before you go, I want to say one more thing. If this story felt a little too familiar, if you're currently living through something like what you just heard, I want you to remember something. The person in this story didn't win because they got lucky. They won because they were strategic. They documented everything. They stayed calm. They played the long game. And most importantly, they trusted their instincts even when everyone told them they were wrong. You can do that too. If you need more reminders of what's possible, more examples of how to handle betrayal with intelligence and grace, I've got more stories for you. They're on your screen right now. Watch them. Learn from them. Let them remind you of your own power. Subscribe to this channel. I'll see you in the next story, and I'm rooting for you and yours.